The 4th of June, 1942, dawned with deceptive calm over the Pacific Ocean, but beneath the surface of Imperial Japan's mighty naval machine, failures had been accumulating like rust on steel, invisible, corrosive, and catastrophic. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, his flagship, watching the pre-dawn darkness surrender to gray light. He carried within him a secret that gnawed at his conscience. He knew the intelligence reports were incomplete, the planning rushed, and the assumptions dangerously optimistic. Yet he had said nothing. None of them had. 6 months earlier, the Imperial Japanese Navy had stunned the world with its attack on Pearl Harbor. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical architect of that devastating strike, had orchestrated what seemed like the perfect operation. Torpedo bombers had skimmed across Oahu's waters while dive bombers screamed down from the heavens, catching the American Pacific Fleet in a moment of vulnerability that would echo through history. The success had been intoxicating, transformative, and ultimately blinding. What the admirals never discussed in their immaculate briefing rooms aboard the battleship Yamato was that Pearl Harbor had been a tactical triumph masking strategic oversights. The American aircraft carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga had been absent that morning, hunting through open waters or delivering aircraft to distant bases. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the combined fleet's commander-in-chief, had noted this privately but never emphasized it in his reports to Tokyo. To do so would have diminished the victory's luster, questioned the Navy's supremacy, and invited dangerous scrutiny from an Imperial General Headquarters already divided between Army and Navy factions. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japan's carrier strike force swept through the Pacific like a typhoon. They struck at Wake Island, supported invasions throughout the Dutch East Indies, and ranged as far as Ceylon in the Indian Ocean. Each victory reinforced the myth of invincibility that now surrounded Nagamo's first air fleet. Captain Nasuo Fukita, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, became a national hero whose tactical judgments were treated as infallible. The younger pilots worshipped him. The older officers deferred to his combat experience. But errors were multiplying in silence. The Navy's intelligence division, led by officers who had never questioned their methods, failed to recognize that American cryptanalysts had penetrated their most sensitive naval codes. Commander Joseph Rochore, working in a basement facility at Pearl Harbor, designated as Station HYPO, had assembled a team that was systematically unraveling Japanese communications. According to naval historian Gordon Prange's authoritative account in his work examining the Midway campaign, this intelligence breakthrough would prove decisive, yet Japanese naval intelligence remained confident in their encryption systems, never conducting the thorough security reviews that might have revealed the compromise. Within the carrier force itself, operational problems festered beneath the surface polish. The veteran pilots who had trained for years were being depleted through combat attrition and dispersal to training commands. Their replacements arrived with fewer flight hours, less gunnery practice, and inadequate carrier landing experience. Maintenance crews worked exhausting schedules keeping the aircraft operational, but no admiral dared report to Tokyo that the pace of operations was degrading readiness. To admit weakness was to invite shame, and shame was a burden no samurai officer could bear. The Doolittle raid in April had changed everything, though few acknowledged it openly. When Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's 16 B-25 bombers lifted from the carrier Hornet's pitching deck on the 18th of April, 1942, they accomplished something the Japanese High Command had declared impossible. American bombers struck Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe in broad daylight, their engines thundering over the sacred home islands where the emperor himself resided. The physical damage was negligible, a few factories scorched, several dozen civilians killed, but the psychological impact reverberated through every level of Japanese military and political leadership like an earthquake's aftershock. Admiral Yamamoto felt the blow personally. As combined fleet commander, the security of Japanese waters fell under his responsibility. The fact that enemy bombers had penetrated to the capital represented a profound failure of naval air defense. In the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Navy, such failures demanded consequences. But Yamamoto was too powerful, too politically connected, and too strategically valuable to be removed. Instead, the pressure converted into resolve. Japan must expand its defensive perimeter, push American carrier forces beyond striking range of the home islands, and do so decisively. The Midway operation emerged from this imperative. Rear Admiral Motomu Gaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, drafted the initial concept during late April aboard the battleship Yamato, anchored at Hashirajima. The plan envisioned a complex, multi-pronged offensive that would simultaneously strike at the Aleutian Islands in the north and Midway Atoll in the Central Pacific. The underlying assumption was that the American Pacific Fleet, stung by months of defeat and humiliation, would rush to Midway's defense and be annihilated by overwhelming Japanese forces. Commander Yasuji Watanabe, who served in the Naval General Staff's Operations Section, harbored deep reservations about the plan's complexity. The operation required precise coordination between forces separated by thousands of miles of ocean, strict adherence to radio silence, and assumptions about enemy behavior that Watanabe considered optimistic at best. During planning conferences, he raised questions about what would happen if American carriers appeared earlier than expected, or in greater numbers, or from unexpected directions. His concerns were noted politely, then dismissed. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, another of Yamamoto's senior staff officers, was known for his brilliance and his eccentricity. He would pace the operations room aboard Yamato for hours, chain-smoking cigarettes while contemplating the vast Pacific chart that dominated one wall. Kuroshima understood that the Midway plan's success depended entirely on surprise and superior intelligence. If the Americans somehow learned of the operation in advance, if they positioned their carriers in ambush, the entire edifice of assumptions could collapse catastrophically. But Kuroshima, like the others, could not bring himself to challenge Yamamoto directly or insist on more conservative approaches. The planning sessions revealed deeper fissures within the command structure. Nagumo's carrier force would bear the operational burden of the attack, yet Nagumo himself was not a naval aviator. He had risen through the ranks as a torpedo and destroyer specialist, receiving command of the First Air Fleet largely through seniority and political connections. His relationship with Genda, his air operations officer, was respectful but strained. Genda possessed the tactical vision and aviation expertise that Nagumo lacked, but Japanese military culture demanded that Nagumo maintain final authority even in matters where his understanding was limited. Fukita noticed the tension during planning sessions held on Akagi. The air group commanders would propose tactics while Nagumo listened with an expression that revealed little. Sometimes he would approve decisions he clearly didn't fully comprehend, deferring to Genda's judgment without admitting his own uncertainty. Other times he would overrule sound, tactical suggestions because they contradicted his instincts formed in surface warfare rather than carrier operations. The aviators learned to frame their proposals carefully, appealing to concepts Nagumo understood while obscuring the more technical aspects of carrier air warfare. None of this dysfunction was ever formally reported. The Imperial Japanese Navy maintained a public facade of perfect unity and competence. Commander Minoru Genda stood before the map table in Akagi's operations room, studying the intelligence summaries that had arrived via encrypted radio from Tokyo. The reports indicated that American carrier forces remained dispersed and damaged following the Coral Sea battle in early May, where Lexington had been sunk and Yorktown seriously damaged. According to Japanese naval intelligence estimates, the Americans could deploy at most 2 fleet carriers to oppose the Midway operation. Genda found this assessment both reassuring and troubling in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The intelligence division's confidence rested on assumptions that had never been rigorously tested. Japanese reconnaissance capabilities in the Central Pacific were limited by the vast distances involved and the shortage of long-range patrol aircraft. The Navy operated excellent flying boats, including the Kawanishi AKK Emily, but never enough of them to maintain continuous surveillance across millions of square miles of ocean. Gaps in coverage were inevitable, yet intelligence officers consistently interpreted the absence of reported American activity as evidence that no activity existed. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, commanding the submarine I-168, received orders in late May to establish a reconnaissance line northwest of Hawaii, positioned to detect any American carrier movements toward Midway. The submarine picket line represented a critical component of the operation's intelligence architecture. If American carriers sortied from Pearl Harbor, Japanese submarines would provide advanced warning, allowing Nagamo to position his forces advantageously. The plan appeared sound in theory, but Tanabe recognized a fatal flaw. The submarines were scheduled to reach their stations on the 3rd of June, yet the Midway attack was planned for the 4th. The timing left minimal margin for error and assumed the Americans would react to the attack rather than anticipating it. What Japanese intelligence failed to comprehend was the revolution occurring in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Rochefort's cryptanalysis team had achieved what Japanese officers considered impossible: systematic penetration of the Japanese Navy's primary operational code, designated JUN-25B by American analysts. Through exhausting work that involved mathematical analysis, linguistic pattern recognition, and inspired intuition, Rochefort's team could read significant portions of Japanese naval communications. The breakthrough regarding Midway came through a clever deception. American analysts had intercepted numerous references to an objective designated AF in Japanese messages. Rochefort believed AF referred to Midway, but he needed confirmation. He arranged for Midway's garrison to transmit an uncoded message reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had malfunctioned. Within days, Japanese communications referenced reports that AF was experiencing freshwater problems. The identification was confirmed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, received Rochefort's intelligence assessments with the careful attention of a man who understood that the war's trajectory might pivot on whether these estimates proved accurate. Nimitz was a submariner by training, a patient strategic thinker who had spent the months since Pearl Harbor rebuilding American naval confidence while avoiding the kind of decisive battle that might result in catastrophic defeat. Now Rochefort was telling him that Japan would commit its entire carrier striking force to an operation whose location, timing, and objectives were known in advance. Nimitz faced profound decisions. The carrier Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, was limping back to Pearl Harbor with a bomb-inflicted wound that Navy engineers estimated would require 3 months in dry dock to repair properly. Nimitz ordered the repair accomplished in 3 days. Round-the-clock work crews swarmed over the carrier, welding steel plates, replacing damaged systems, and jury-rigging solutions that would hold together long enough for one more battle. Enterprise and Hornet were recalled from the South Pacific and ordered to rendezvous northeast of Midway. Meanwhile, Japanese planning proceeded with no awareness of how completely their intentions had been compromised. Nagamo's staff continued refining attack plans based on the assumption of tactical surprise. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu. His flagship, watching maintenance crews service the Aichi D-3 dive bombers spotted on the forward deck. Yamaguchi was 49 years old, a graduate of the Naval Academy at Etajima who had studied at Princeton University and served as naval attaché in Washington. His experience in America gave him perspectives that many of his colleagues lacked, including a deep respect for American industrial capacity and a suspicion that Japan's early victories had created dangerous overconfidence within the Navy's leadership. During the planning conferences for the Midway operation, Yamaguchi had been one of the few senior officers willing to voice concerns, though even he framed his objections carefully to avoid direct contradiction of Yamamoto's strategic vision. He questioned the division of forces between the Aleutians and Midway operations, arguing that concentration of strength offered better prospects than dispersal. He worried about the complex timing requirements that left little flexibility for responding to unexpected developments. Most significantly, he doubted whether Japanese intelligence truly understood American carrier locations and intentions. Commander Susumu Kawaguchi, Hiryu's air officer, shared Yamaguchi's concerns but felt constrained by his junior rank from expressing them openly. Kawaguchi had noticed troubling patterns in recent operations. The Pearl Harbor attack had succeeded brilliantly in destroying battleships but had missed the carriers. The Indian Ocean raids had found British naval forces where intelligence predicted, yet the engagement outcomes had been less decisive than hoped. At Coral Sea, Japanese and American carrier forces had fought the first naval battle in history where surface ships never came within sight of each other, and the results had been ambiguous at best. Shokaku had been damaged, Suikaku had lost much of her air group, and Lexington had been sunk, but the Port Moresby invasion had been turned back. These were not the crushing victories that the Navy's public pronouncements described. They were costly, grinding engagements that depleted irreplaceable pilots and aircraft. Kawaguchi sometimes calculated the loss rates privately, comparing pilot casualties against training pipeline capacity, and the mathematics disturbed him. Japan was winning battles while slowly bleeding to death, but raising such concerns would label him defeatist, perhaps even traitorous in the current atmosphere of nationalist fervor. The pilot briefings revealed another layer of problems. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, Hiryu's air group commander, was a superb aviator and tactician, but even he could not compensate for the degraded training levels among newer pilots. The replacements arriving from training squadrons had accumulated perhaps 200 flight hours before joining operational units. Before the war, fleet pilots had received 500 to 700 hours of training. The differences manifested in combat effectiveness, navigation accuracy, and susceptibility to combat stress. Veteran pilots could compensate for damaged aircraft, navigate by dead reckoning across featureless ocean, and maintain formation discipline under fire. Newer pilots struggled with all of these skills. Fukita understood these realities intimately. As overall air commander for Nagumo's carrier strike force, he bore responsibility for coordinating attacks involving hundreds of aircraft operating from 4 separate carriers. The complexity was extraordinary. Different carrier air groups had different capabilities, pilot experience levels, and aircraft conditions. Coordinating a mass strike required precise timing, clear communications, and flexible contingency planning. Yet the operational culture discouraged contingency planning because it implied doubt about the primary plan's effectiveness. On the 1st of June, as the fleet sortied from its anchorage at Hashirajima, Fukita was suffering from appendicitis. He insisted on remaining with the fleet despite significant pain, unwilling to miss the operation that he and others expected would decisively cripple American naval power in the Pacific. Navy surgeons operated on him aboard Akagi, performing the appendectomy under less than ideal conditions while the carrier plowed through increasingly rough seas. Fukita recovered enough to participate in planning sessions, but his mobility was limited and his stamina reduced at precisely the moment when his tactical judgment would be most critically needed. Nagumo watched his fleet assembling with mixed emotions. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the Striking Forces Corps, supported by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Additional forces including Yamamoto's main body with 3 battleships and the light carrier, Hosho, followed several hundred miles behind, ready to engage any American surface forces that might appear. The invasion force carrying troops to occupy Midway approached from a different direction. The entire operation involved approximately 200 ships stretching across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. The scale was impressive, but scale alone could not compensate for the fundamental errors embedded in the operation's architecture. The 2nd of June brought heavy weather that Captain Ryusaku Yanejimoto, commanding the carrier Soryu, found both troublesome and reassuring. Troublesome because the rough seas complicated flight operations, made refueling from oilers dangerous, and reduced visibility for the screening destroyers trying to maintain their anti-submarine patrol stations. Reassuring because the same weather that hampered Japanese operations also degraded American reconnaissance capabilities, making it less likely that patrol planes from Midway would detect the approaching fleet prematurely. Yanejimoto was a careful, methodical officer who had commanded Soryu since November of 1941. He maintained strict discipline aboard his ship while fostering a culture that encouraged subordinates to speak honestly about operational concerns. This approach was somewhat unusual in the Imperial Japanese Navy, where rigid hierarchy often stifled communication. During planning discussions with his air group commanders, Yanejimoto had encouraged frank assessments of aircraft readiness, pilot proficiency, and tactical challenges. The picture that emerged troubled him. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Igusa, One of the Navy's most experienced div bomber pilots, commanded Soryuz Aichi D-3A units. Igusa had participated in nearly every major carrier operation since the war began, and his strike successes had made him legendary among naval aviators. But Igusa confided to Yanagimoto that the operational tempo was becoming unsustainable. Aircraft required more maintenance time than they were receiving. Pilots needed rest to maintain peak performance, yet the constant cycle of operations, transit, and alert status left little time for recuperation. Minor injuries and illnesses were accumulating across the air groups, degrading overall capability in ways that didn't appear in official readiness reports. Commander Takahisa Amagai, Kaga's senior air officer, observed similar patterns aboard his carrier. Kaga was one of the Navy's oldest carriers, a converted battleship hull that lacked the speed and maneuverability of the purpose-built carriers. Her air group had performed superbly at Pearl Harbor and during subsequent operations, but Amagai noticed that maintenance issues were requiring an increasing percentage of aircraft to be listed as non-operational at any given time. Spare parts were becoming scarce for certain critical components. The Navy's logistics system, optimized for the operational tempo of peacetime exercises, was straining under wartime demands. None of these concerns were formally communicated up the chain of command. To do so would have raised questions about Amagai's leadership, suggested that Kaga was less ready than other carriers, and potentially resulted in the ship being held back from the operation. Pride, ambition, and organizational culture combined to ensure that problems remained hidden until they erupted into crises. On the morning of the 3rd of June, Nagumo's strike force reached a position approximately 600 nautical miles northwest of Midway. The weather had moderated slightly, allowing more comfortable steaming conditions. At 0430 hours, the fleet began the complex dance of launching the first search planes. 7 Nakajima B-5 carrier attack bombers, each configured for reconnaissance rather than strike missions, were catapulted from the 4 carriers to search sectors radiating eastward toward Midway and the expected location of any American naval forces. The search plan contained a critical flaw that Genda had identified during planning but had been unable to correct without challenging fundamental assumptions. The search patterns were designed to detect American forces reacting to the Midway attack, steaming westward from Pearl Harbor as Japanese intelligence predicted. The patterns provided minimal coverage of the area northeast of the carriers, where American forces might be positioned if they had somehow anticipated the Japanese operation. Genda had suggested more comprehensive search patterns, but Nagumo's staff had rejected them as unnecessarily cautious and fuel-intensive. Lieutenant Arata Sanada, flying one of the search aircraft from Akagi, proceeded along his assigned bearing as the sun climbed above the eastern horizon. His sector took him toward Midway but slightly north of the direct route. From 5,000 feet altitude, visibility extended to the horizon in all directions, revealing only empty ocean broken by scattered whitecaps. Tsunada dutifully reported his observations via radio. No enemy contacts, weather clearing, visibility good. His reports, and those of the other search aircraft, reinforced Nagumo's assumption that the path to Midway was clear. What the search planes could not detect were the 3 American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, already positioned 200 miles northeast of Midway under the command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Fletcher had received orders from Nimitz that reflected the intelligence advantage. America had gained through code breaking, get into position northeast of Midway, avoid detection and wait for the Japanese carriers to reveal themselves by launching their attack on the atoll. Then strike. Fletcher commanded from Yorktown, with Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance controlling Enterprise and Hornet as a separate task force. The American carriers maintained strict radio silence, operated at economical speeds to conserve fuel, and positioned their screening destroyers to maximize anti-submarine coverage. Patrol planes from Midway extended American reconnaissance far to the west, creating overlapping search patterns that would almost certainly detect any approaching Japanese forces. At 0553 hours on the morning of the 4th of June, a consolidated PBY Catalina patrol aircraft flown by Ensign Jules Reed detected the first elements of Nagumo's strike force. Reed transmitted a brief contact report that electrified Midway's command center. Enemy carriers. The trap was about to be sprung, but neither side yet understood how profoundly the battle would deviate from their expectations. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida lay in his bunk aboard Akagi, frustrated by his post-surgical condition that prevented him from leading the morning strike personally. The honor fell instead to Lieutenant Joichi Tamanaga from Hiryu, an excellent choice, but one that left Fuchida feeling disconnected from the unfolding operation. Through the bulkheads, he could hear the familiar sounds of flight operations, aircraft engines warming up, the thump of aircraft elevators bringing planes from the hangar deck, the shouted commands of deck crews preparing for launch. At 0430 hours, exactly on schedule, the strike force began launching the Midway attack. 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima B-5 torpedo bombers carrying land attack bombs, 36 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M. 0 fighters rose from the 4 carriers and formed into a massive formation that headed southeast toward Midway Atoll, 140 miles distant. Tamanaga led them into the brightening dawn, confident in his pilot's training and the overwhelming force they represented. Nagamo retained a substantial reserve force on his carriers, 36. B-5NS armed with torpedoes for anti-ship strikes, 36 additional D-3As and defensive fighters. This reserve reflected standard doctrine keep forces ready to respond to unexpected developments, particularly the appearance of enemy warships. Genda had developed these protocols during planning for Pearl Harbor, and they had served well in subsequent operations. At 0553 hours, Midway's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as Marines and Navy personnel rushed to battle stations. Every operational aircraft on Midway fighters, bombers, and patrol planes scrambled to get airborne, either to intercept the Japanese formation or to escape destruction on the ground. The American fighters, a motley collection of Marine F-2 Buffaloes and F-4F Wildcats, climbed desperately to intercept altitude. The aerial combat that developed over Midway demonstrated both the excellence of Japanese naval aviation and the courage of American defenders. The Marine fighters attacked the bomber formations with determination, but the obsolete Buffaloes were completely outmatched by the escorting Zeros. Lieutenant Colonel I.R. Kimes, leading one of the Marine fighter squadrons, watched his pilots being cut to pieces by Japanese fighters that could outmaneuver, outclimb, and outgun anything the Americans could put in the air. Of 25 Marine fighters that engaged the Japanese formation, 17 were shot down and another 7 damaged. The Marines inflicted minimal losses on the Japanese strike force in return. Tamanaga's bombers pressed through to their targets, dropping bombs on Midway's airfield facilities, fuel storage, and defensive positions. The raid was professionally executed, but as Tamanaga circled above the atoll assessing damage, he realized the attack had been insufficient. Midway's runways were cratered, but still usable. Hangars were burning, but aircraft were still taking off. Most critically, he could see that the shore batteries and anti-aircraft positions remained substantially operational. If Japanese troops were going to land on Midway as planned, another strike would be necessary to suppress these defenses. At 0700 hours, Tamanaga transmitted the message that would set disaster in motion. "There is need for a second attack wave," the message reached Akagi just as the tactical situation was becoming vastly more complicated than Japanese planning had envisioned. At 0728 hours, a float plane from the cruiser tone transmitted a stunning report. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Nagamo stared at the message flimsy as though it were written in an incomprehensible language. Enemy surface ships? 240 miles away? American carriers should have been at Pearl Harbor, or perhaps still in the South Pacific. Intelligence had assured him that at most 2 carriers might respond to the Midway attack, and they should be approaching from the east, not from the northeast where the Tone's float plane had spotted contacts. Genda immediately recognized the tactical implications. If American carriers were in the vicinity, everything changed. The reserve strike force, currently armed with bombs for a second Midway attack, needed to be rearmed with torpedoes for anti-ship strikes. But the first strike force would be returning from Midway within the hour, requiring the carrier's flight decks to be clear for recovery operations. An American aircraft could already be inbound. The moment of decision had arrived, and every choice available to Nagamo was complicated by factors that planning had either minimized or ignored entirely. Vice Admiral Nagamo faced the most critical decision of his career with incomplete information and time evaporating like morning mist. The contact report from Tone's floatplane had not specified whether the American surface force included carriers, the single most important piece of information he needed. Nagamo ordered the scout plane to clarify its report and maintain contact, but radio communications were erratic and the follow-up message was delayed. At 07:45 hours, Nagamo made his first major decision: rearm the reserve strike force from land attack bombs to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs suitable for attacking warships. The order initiated a frenzy of activity throughout the carrier force. On Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu ordnance crews began the laborious process of hauling bombs back to the magazines, bringing up torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs and reconfiguring aircraft that had already been meticulously prepared for the second Midway strike. Lieutenant Commander Shogo Masuda, Akagi's ordnance officer, supervised the rearmament with growing apprehension. The process violated standard safety protocols that existed for excellent reasons. In the interest of speed, removed bombs were not being returned to the magazines immediately, but were instead being stacked on the hangar deck, creating a dangerous concentration of explosives in a confined space. Torpedoes were being attached to aircraft using hasty procedures that didn't allow for proper inspection. Masuda considered reporting his concerns to the bridge, but decided against it. The urgency was obvious, and questioning orders during combat operations could be interpreted as cowardice or insubordination. At 0800 hours, the floatplane from Tone emitted an amplifying report. Enemy ships appear to be 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. No carriers mentioned. Nagamo allowed himself a moment of relief. Cruisers and destroyers represented a threat, but not an existential one. The American surface force could be engaged by his escorting battleships and cruisers, while his carriers continued, preparing for the second Midway strike. At 0809 hours, Nagamo reversed his previous order: continue arming the reserve force with land attack bombs for the second Midway strike. The countermand created confusion throughout the carrier force. Some aircraft had already been fully rearmed with torpedoes. Others were in mid-transition. Ordnance crews who had been rushing to comply with the initial order now had to reverse course, creating bottlenecks on the hangar decks where torpedoes and bombs competed for limited space and handling equipment. Genda watched the chaos developing with a sense of foreboding he couldn't articulate. The carrier's operational rhythm, so smooth during peacetime exercises and early wartime operations, was breaking down under the pressure of simultaneous demands. The first Midway strike force was approaching for recovery. The reserve force was in disarray with armament in transition. Defensive fighters were cycling through combat air patrol duties, requiring periodic landings for fuel and ammunition replenishment. And the intelligence picture regarding American forces remained maddeningly unclear. At 0820 hours, a message from Tone's floatplane shattered what remained of Nagamo's tactical assumptions. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. An American carrier operating exactly where Japanese intelligence had insisted no carriers could be. Nagamo felt the operational calculus shifting beneath his feet like sand in an earthquake. If American carriers were present, if they launched strikes, his own carriers would be vulnerable during the complex recovery and rearming operations now underway. The safe course would be to immediately launch whatever aircraft were ready, even if their armament wasn't optimal. But the first strike force from Midway was already beginning to arrive overhead, fuel critical, several aircraft damaged, pilots exhausted from combat. Captain Arimoto Goto, Kaga's commanding officer, faced the immediate operational crisis on his flight deck. Aircraft from the Midway strike were circling overhead, transmitting increasingly urgent requests for landing clearance. Their fuel gauges showed minimum reserves. Some had battle damage requiring immediate attention. But the flight deck was still spotted with reserve aircraft that hadn't yet been rearmed, and the rearming couldn't continue with aircraft landing and taking off. At 0837 hours, American aircraft appeared in the sky above the Japanese carrier force. They were Marine Corps' Douglas SBD, Dauntless dive bombers, and Army Air Force B-17 flying fortresses from Midway, attacking in uncoordinated waves that the Japanese combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire turned back without difficulty. The attacks inflicted no damage but consumed precious time and added to the tactical confusion. Nagamo made his final critical decision: recover all aircraft from the Midway strike before launching any attacks against the American carrier force. It was a reasonable decision based on standard doctrine and humane concern for his pilots. It was also the decision that would doom his fleet, though he could not know that yet. The phrase that would echo through Japanese naval history, though never officially recorded, was uttered by a junior officer on Akagi's bridge at approximately 0915 hours, the Nakajima moment, a colloquial expression meaning the instant when accumulated. Small failures cascade into catastrophic disaster. Lieutenant Hashimoto Kozo, serving as Assistant Operations Officer, saw the converging crises with crystal clarity, but lacked the authority to alter decisions already made. By 0918 hours, all 4 Japanese carriers had recovered their Midway strike aircraft. Flight decks were now crowded with planes being refueled and rearmed. The reserve strike force, finally equipped with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs appropriate for attacking enemy carriers, was spotted on deck ready for launch. Pilots were receiving final briefings. Within 30 minutes, perhaps 45 at most, a massive strike would be airborne heading for the American carrier force, now estimated to be approximately 200 miles northeast. What neither Nagamo nor his staff officers knew was that American dive bombers were already screaming, down from 20,000 feet toward his unprotected carriers. The American strike had been launched in stages from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The coordination disrupted by communication difficulties and the challenges of assembling formations from 3 separate carriers, operating under radio silence. Torpedo squadrons from all 3 carriers had attacked first, pressing through Japanese fighter screens and anti-aircraft fire with suicidal courage but achieving no hits. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, was annihilated, all 15 aircraft shot down, only Ensign George Gay surviving in the water to witness what followed. The torpedo attacks, though unsuccessful, accomplished something critically important. They drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, chasing the low-flying American torpedo bombers through their attack runs. Japanese fighters were perfectly positioned to slaughter the torpedo squadrons, but completely out of position to defend against dive bombers attacking from high altitude. At 0920 hours, Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber squadron, spotted the white wakes of Japanese ships far below. McCluskey had been searching for the Japanese carriers at the limits of his fuel range, gambling that intelligence estimates of their location were accurate. Now the gamble had paid off. He could see 4 carriers maneuvering in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft, perfect targets for the 33 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers following his lead. McCluskey selected Kaga, the nearest carrier, and pushed over into his attack dive. Behind him, his squadron followed in sequence, one bomber after another tipping over and plunging down toward the target. At almost the same instant, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading Yorktown's dive bomber squadron, attacked Soryu from a different direction. The Japanese carriers were under simultaneous attack by dive bombers they had not detected and could not effectively defend against. On Akagi, the first indication of the attack was the scream of American dive bombers pulling out of their dives. Captain Teijiro Oki, commanding the carrier, looked up to CSBD Dauntlesses dropping away from his ship, having already released their bombs. The world seemed to move in slow motion as Aoki watched 1,000-pound bombs arcing toward his ship's flight deck, where aircraft packed with fuel and ordnance sat waiting to launch. The first bomb struck Akagi's flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among the aircraft and ordnance stored there. The explosion ignited aviation fuel and touched off secondary explosions as bombs and torpedoes cooked off in the intense heat. Within seconds, the entire midship section of the carrier was a roaring inferno. Captain Goto Onkaga watched in horror as dive bombers attacked his ship in sequence. 4 bombs hit in rapid succession, one penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated the aviation fuel tanks, another starting fires among the aircraft spotted forward, a third destroying the bridge and killing most of the senior officers instantly. Goto survived the initial hits but found himself commanding a ship that was transforming into a funeral pyre before his eyes. On Soryu, Captain Yanagimoto was thrown to the deck by the impact of 3 bombs in quick succession. The explosions occurred within the span of perhaps 90 seconds, but they accomplished what Japanese damage control doctrine had never envisioned as possible. Fires erupted simultaneously in multiple locations, overwhelming the ship's firefighting capacity. The forward elevator was blown out of its shaft, creating a chimney that drew flames from the hangar deck up through the flight deck. Aircraft loaded with fuel and armed with ordnance exploded in chain reactions that sent shrapnel slicing through bulkheads and flesh alike. Nagamo stood on Akagi's bridge, stunned into momentary immobility as his flagship shuddered from internal explosions. Smoke billowed from the hangar deck, and flames were visible through gaps torn in the flight deck structure. Commander Tamatsu Oishi, the ship's damage control officer, was already organizing firefighting parties, but even as crews dragged hoses toward the flames, secondary explosions threw men across compartments and ignited new fires faster than the old ones could be extinguished. Genda appeared at Nagamo's side, his face pale but his voice steady. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag to a ship that can continue operations. Akagi is finished as an operational carrier." The words felt like treason to speak, but Genda knew they were true. Even if the fires could be controlled, and that was far from certain, the damage to flight operations capability was catastrophic. At 0925 hours, just 5 minutes after the American dive bombers had begun their attacks, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were burning wrecks, their strike aircraft destroyed on deck, their crews fighting desperately to contain fires that were consuming their ships from within. The operation that was supposed to crush American naval power in the Pacific had instead resulted in the worst disaster in Japanese naval history, and the battle was not yet over. The carrier Hiryu, commanded by Captain Tomio Kaku and carrying the flag of Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, had been steaming slightly separated from the other 3 carriers when the American dive bombers struck. This separation, a routine formation adjustment to maximize maneuvering space, meant Hiryu escaped the initial attack unscathed. Yamaguchi immediately recognized that his ship represented Japan's only remaining offensive capability in the battle and ordered an immediate strike against the American carriers. Lieutenant Tamunaga, who had led the morning strike on Midway and whose aircraft had been damaged in that attack, volunteered to lead Hiryu's strike despite knowing his damaged fuel tank meant he could not return. At 10:30 hours, 18 D-3A dive bombers and 60 fighters launched from Hiryu and headed northeast toward the American carriers. Tomonaga's courage exemplified the spirit that had carried Japanese naval aviation to its early victories. But courage alone could not compensate for the tactical situation now facing Japan. The strike found Yorktown and scored 3 bomb hits that brought the American carrier to a halt, dead in the water and listing. It was a skilled attack that demonstrated Japanese naval aviation still possessed formidable capabilities even after the morning's catastrophe. But Tomonaga did not return, dying when his damaged aircraft plunged into the sea. At 0:30 hours, Hiryu launched a second Strike 10 B-5N torpedo bombers and 6 fighters that hit Yorktown with 2 torpedoes, ensuring the American carrier's eventual loss. Yet these successes were Pyrrhic. American scout planes located Hiryu at 03:15 hours in the afternoon. At 0500 hours, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise attacked, scoring 4 bomb hits that set Hiryu ablaze just as her sister ships had burned that morning. Yamaguchi refused to abandon ship, choosing to die with his command and with the samurai traditions that had shaped his entire life. By evening of the 4th of June, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and approximately 3,000 officers and men, including many of the service's most experienced pilots and aviation technicians. American losses totaled 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and approximately 300 personnel. The strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. In the days that followed, as the surviving Japanese ships limped back toward their bases, the admirals began the painful process of understanding what had occurred. Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from hundreds of miles away aboard Yamato, had ordered additional forces to support Nagamo, but by the time these reinforcements could arrive, the battle was already lost. On the 7th of June, he canceled the Midway operation and ordered a general withdrawal. The reports that filtered up through the chain of command were necessarily incomplete and sanitized. No admiral wished to detail the specific failures that had contributed to disaster, the inadequate search patterns, the decision to rearm aircraft multiple times, the vulnerability created by spotting fully fueled and armed aircraft on flight decks, the failure to maintain adequate combat air patrol altitude, the intelligence failures that had left the fleet blind to American dispositions. Commander Genda survived the battle, but carried with him the burden of understanding how Japanese doctrine and assumptions had failed. In later years, when he could speak more freely, he identified the fundamental error. Japanese planning had assumed everything would work perfectly and that the enemy would cooperate by behaving as predicted. There had been no resilience built into the system, no acknowledgement that uncertainty was inherent in warfare, no willingness to question assumptions that later proved catastrophically wrong. Fuchida also survived, evacuated from Akagi before the carrier sank. He spent months recovering from his injuries and from something deeper, a psychological wound inflicted by witnessing the destruction of the carrier force he had helped make famous. In memoirs written after the war, Fuchida acknowledged what few had dared say in 1942. The seeds of Midway's disaster had been planted months earlier in the overconfidence generated by Pearl Harbor's success, and in the institutional culture that punished bearers of bad news while rewarding optimistic assessments regardless of their accuracy. The underwater graves of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rest on the Pacific floor northwest of Midway Atoll, monuments to the officers and men who paid with their lives for errors their admirals dared not admit existed. The carrier settled in deep water Kaga at approximately 17,000 feet, Akagi at 18,000 feet, Soryu at 17,000 feet. Hiryu, which burned longer before sinking, came to rest at 18,000 feet. Research expeditions in later decades would photograph the wrecks, documenting the bomb damage that had proven catastrophic and the subsequent deterioration as the ocean slowly reclaimed the steel and machinery that had once represented the pinnacle of naval aviation technology. For the United States, Midway represented vindication of the intelligence breakthrough that Rochefort and his team had achieved. The ability to read Japanese naval communications had provided advance warning that transformed a potential disaster into decisive victory. Admiral Nimitz would later state that Rochefort's work had been worth more than an entire fleet, an assessment that subsequent historians have generally supported. The battle's outcome shifted the Pacific War's trajectory in ways that became clearer as time progressed. Japan retained formidable naval forces including battleships, heavy cruisers, and several smaller carriers, but the loss of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced air groups represented a blow from which Japanese naval aviation never fully recovered. The training pipeline could produce new pilots, but not with the skill levels of those lost at Midway. Industrial production could build new carriers, but not at the rate American shipyards were already achieving. Perhaps most significantly, Midway shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Japanese arms since Pearl Harbor. The myth that Japanese forces were inherently superior, that Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, could overcome material disadvantages, had been exposed as dangerous self-delusion. The admirals who survived Midway understood this at some level, though the rigid culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy made frank acknowledgement impossible. In the decades after the war, as scholars gained access to Japanese documents and survivors shared their testimonies, the full extent of the errors became clear. The operation had been compromised from the beginning by faulty intelligence, dispersed forces, inadequate reconnaissance, and decision-making processes that discouraged dissent and punished candor. Admiral Nagamo had made tactical errors during the battle, but those errors occurred within a strategic framework that was fundamentally flawed. The institutional culture that prevented admirals from admitting errors before Midway continued to plague Japanese military operations throughout the war. Defeats were minimized in official reports, losses were concealed from the public, and the same patterns of optimistic planning and inadequate intelligence repeated themselves in subsequent campaigns. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 and the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944 would demonstrate that the lessons of Midway had not been adequately absorbed. Today, historians recognize Midway as one of the most decisive naval battles in history, comparable to Trafalgar or Tsushima in its strategic consequences. The battle demonstrated that carrier aviation had become the dominant form of naval power, that intelligence and code-breaking could provide decisive advantages, and that the side which adapted more quickly to changing circumstances would prevail regardless of initial advantages. The human dimension remains most poignant. Thousands of young men, Japanese and American, died in the waters around Midway, most of them never recovering the surface after their aircraft were shot down or their ships sank. They were victims not only of enemy action, but of institutional failures, strategic miscalculations, and the inability of senior leaders to acknowledge uncomfortable truths before those truths manifested as catastrophe. The final irony is that Japanese naval officers understood many of these problems before Midway, but felt constrained by culture, hierarchy, and institutional momentum from acting on their concerns. The errors that undid Japan's fleet were not mysteries. They were known vulnerabilities that no admiral dared to admit openly enough to force systemic change. In that silence, in that unwillingness to speak truth to power, lay the seeds of one of history's most decisive defeats.